What's going on, everybody? Golf season is back. We've got our first big event of the year with the American Express this week, and I wanted to get a video out walking through how to build winning PGA DFS lineups with SaberSim this season. My name is Jordan Chan. I'm SaberSim's head coach, and in this video, I'll walk through a basic process that you can use in your builds to set yourself up for success this season, making sure that you understand the value of the simulations you're using, the right buttons to push in the right order in order to build your lineups, and exactly how you can plug in your own research and takes. Let's go ahead and dive into it here. So step one, when we sit down to build here, is going to be to upload our entries file. So we'll go over to the contest tab and go ahead and get our entries file uploaded. This is going to bring in the contests that we're playing, make it easier to get our lineups into those contests, as well as generate our contest sim settings to use when we go to run our contest sim. Next up, we can go over to our build and get ready to build some lineups. I personally don't make too many changes to the projections ahead of time before my first build. I really like to see what that first sim looks like. We've put a ton of work into our golf model over the past couple of seasons, and it's tracking everything that's important for projecting player performance. The Vegas odds, course fit, course history, recent and long-term form, as well as big updates to our ownership models. We've put a lot of work into our field lineups and our ownership, and I'm really happy with where the golf model is at heading into this season. So I typically like to see on the first run just what the sims are giving me. You're going to have plenty of time and options to make changes, to make adjustments based on what you're seeing from the sims here. So I'm not going to make any other changes besides the two projection changes that I need to make for DraftKings rules. So we'll make those two changes here. And we'll go ahead and just build 5,000 lineups and get this started here. Now, before I actually hit build, I do want to just mention a couple things in terms of just general strategic timing for golf builds. The projections are generally going to settle in often the day before the event. Our initial projections, barring any significant Vegas line movement or player withdrawals or anything like that, that come out on generally Tuesdays, are also going to be pretty close to what you see on Wednesdays. So really, you can run these builds. You can start working on your process about as early as you start to see projections up in the app, and not very much will change. Again, barring some big change that actually takes place to the event. It can be like a withdrawal or a weather concern or something like that. So these are very likely going to be the final lineups that I end up entering into the contest for this video. You're generally good to start building around this time. It is Wednesday afternoon when I'm doing this one. The one other thing I will note is I typically do like to do a quick scan looking for any questionable players that are on that slate. My general approach with questionable tags in golf is to be very conservative, and I often end up just scratching them off of my list completely and just Xing them out. There's a couple reasons for that. The first is just a practical reason of these slates often lock very early in the morning, and I'm not always going to get up to track these questionables if it's a 4 in the morning tee off time or something like that. So I just prefer to scratch those guys off. They sit often anyway. A lot of times if these golfers are dealing with a back or a different injury or something like that, a lot of times they're going to sit anyway or play hampered. And if you have to have that guy at the end of the tournament, I'm just going to lose that week. That just is what it is. But I feel a little more comfortable and sleep a little easier just scratching off those questionables. So we don't have that on this slate here, but that is something I also take a quick look at. But that's enough on that. Let's go ahead and get the build running here. While this is building, I will give a little bit more detail on what the sims are actually doing. What really sets SaberSim apart and makes it so useful, especially for a sport like golf, is we are not just optimizing the highest average projected lineups like most other tools do here. What we're actually doing is we are running hole by hole simulations of the entire tournament. And then when you build lineups, we are taking those simulations and finding the optimal lineup for a small set of the simulations of the way the tournament can actually play out. So we're accounting for the fact that the top golfers also have some downside potential of missing the cut, that there is a full range of outcomes to those golfers when they make the cut, and building lineups that have the upside that you need to be successful in DFS tournaments because they literally banked the simulations that they were built from. So you are already getting these high upside lineups that aren't necessarily just optimized based on average score. Once the lineups are finished building, we can kick off our contest sim. And this is the other key component for golf DFS. We don't really have a lot of correlation in golf except for some weather potential correlation. I'll touch on that here in just a second. But obviously, all the golfers are independent from each other. It really is truly a game theory sport. That's kind of the big component, the big part of strategy here is, yes, you're going to have some golfers that project better than others relative to their salary, but how much better are they? Is the field overvaluing that projection? Is a player that isn't projected as well, or is maybe a little bit overpriced? Is the field undervaluing that player? It's really just a game theory battle of putting 6 golfers together in a lineup such that you have upside that outweighs how frequently those players appear in the fields that you are playing against. Those are pretty complicated questions to solve for by yourself or using a traditional optimizer. A lot of times you have to have either just a lot of learned experience of how much ownership is too much versus how much projection is enough to outweigh ownership. The contest sims solve that dynamically for you by using the field, using the payout structures and sizes of the contests that you're playing. It accounts for all of that, along with the hole by hole simulations that are powering the way that the lineups are built as well. So it really does help solve some of those complicated questions of, is it good chalk? Is it bad chalk? In a sport where that is basically the primary component. You're not stacking anyone together here. You're really basically just trying to make game theory ownership based decisions. Now that our contest sims are done, you'll see those ROI numbers here start to populate. So that means we are ready for the next step. So now that we have that contest sim data, I do typically like to do a quick fill here and get these lineups into my entries file. Obviously, we're not in danger of missing lock or anything like that, like we might be in a sport like NBA if I was recording an NBA video here, but I typically like to get these entered in anyway, just so I have kind of a baseline to work with. So we'll go over to the autofill tab here, and I recommend sorting by prize pool high to low, making sure that you are on unique rank, and then we can save to contest. And this is basically going to find the best lineups for the birdie contest here, the best 20, put those in there, then the best 50 lineups for the mini max, and then the best 20 for the $1 max here, and get all of those filled. And then we can get this uploaded into DraftKings, and we kind of have our baseline there. So this is the base build. This is the fundamental process here of how I would at least get a build started. And this is exactly the point as well, where you can start to make your own adjustments based on your research here. So I typically really like to focus on these 3 columns: the exposure, the pool, and the leverage column are the things that I primarily focus on. The leverage column is probably the best way to guide your research, to give yourself a sense of where you are relative to the field. It is a good way to target your research, looking at your highest and lowest stands relative to the field in the form of leverage, given that there are dozens, sometimes maybe even over 100 different golfers in the field. It can be hard to know exactly where to start that research process. So I would go through and look at your highest and lowest leverage golfers here and really figure out, are you comfortable with that stand? Now, if you follow golf avidly, this is going to mean a little bit more to you than if you are somewhat inexperienced with golf. If you're not as familiar with golf, maybe you don't have as strong opinions about these golfers on a particular slate, it's fine to kind of roll with what the sims are giving you. But if you are more strongly opinionated about which golfers you want to roster, in my experience, PGA DFS players are some of the more opinionated DFS players out there. So this is a good way to get a quick sense of what the sims are saying about the slate. Now, I don't know as much golf ball as I do for other sports that I'm generally following almost every single day, watching most of the games like football or basketball or something like that. But I play quite a bit of PGA DFS. I enjoy the game theory puzzle quite a bit. So I'll give you a little bit of some ideas of how I typically think about my leverage, my exposure, how I want to approach my portfolio, just to at least maybe get you started on the right foot here. So the first thing is, I generally want to play a very diversified golf portfolio here. Any of these guys, even the top golfers any given week, can miss the cut on any given tournament. There's a ton of variance in this game. The standard deviations for these golfers are extremely high. The ranges of outcomes are very wide. I am not the type of player that wants to go in and X a bunch of golfers out and lock a bunch of golfers in. Though I know that is how some people play, that is not my approach. So right off the bat here, I'm very happy with the fact that I'm seeing a pretty flat exposure curve overall, and I don't want my leverage on any given golfer to be too high. Couple other things that I look for as I'm going over my leverage column. This is going to sound obvious, but I think this just makes sense to me. I typically want to see that my positive leverage golfers are generally guys that have relatively low ownership. And similarly, I want to see that a lot of my big fades on this slate, or relatively speaking, my fades on this slate here, we don't see I'm having a ton of big ones here. I want to see that those are generally going to be higher owned golfers. Because of the way that the projections set up relative to the salary, the projections are very heavily dependent on the Vegas odds of a player winning the tournament, finishing top 5, top 10, making the cut, that kind of stuff. The DraftKings salaries are also based on that same information, and there isn't a lot, I already mentioned it before, there isn't a lot of news that can break leading up to the tournament starting that changes those things. So you have relatively efficient salaries. There are going to be players that are a little bit underpriced relative to their salary, but for the most part, they're pretty solid, and you're not going to see a ton of projection variance within certain salary ranges. As a general rule of thumb, my general approach here is that most chalk is pretty bad chalk in golf. And if there are low owned plays that you can get in a given salary range, those plays are probably good. Now, you can't literally be under the field on every chalky golfer. You can't be literally over the field on every low owned golfer. But overall, as a general theme here, I want to see that my stands are for guys that are relatively low owned, at least in their salary range. Or excuse me, I want to see that my stands here are relatively lower owned players here. And I want to see that my fades are generally relatively higher owned players. Another way you can kind of set this up here is instead sort by the projected ownership and then look at your leverage curve here. And you can kind of see that that is the direction that SaberSim is taking me here. Now, I'm not saying, and I'm very happy to see that the Sims are doing this here, I'm not fading the top 8 highest owned golfers on the slate, but I am more or less equal to or under the field on all of them. And we are taking our largest negative stand on Sung Jae Im here, who is expected to be the chalkiest golfer in the field. You can see there's a little bit of a break point where we start to get to some golfers that I'm over the field on. As soon as we get below that like 15 percentage points of ownership threshold here, you start to see some positive leverage plays sneaking in there. That's generally my approach to the way that I review my lineups and what I'm looking for. I'm setting a pretty high bar for me to want to be over the field on a chalkier golfer. I'm going to be much more comfortable having a fade stance on a lot of these chalky golfers. If I built the lineups and I saw that I had 50% in and he was expected to be 43% owned, that would be a very big sign to me that I want to do a little bit more research and take a look at what's going on there. Maybe it's a slate where he's just literally is the highest projected owned golfer by a mile. We had some Scotty Scheffler slates like that last year where he was projected so far above the rest of the field that it did make sense to just jam him in. Tony Finau at the Mexico Open comes to mind, where he is generally just a tier or 2 tiers above every other golfer in the field and sometimes has a ridiculous odds to win that tournament, and it just makes sense to jam him in every lineup and get different elsewhere. But overall, I am very skeptical of high owned golfers on most golf slates, and I want my fades to represent that. Now, because golf is the kind of sport where you have quite a bit of time to research, I know people do really like to go in deep. Now, a couple resources that I really like to do that with here are the Data Golf Course History tool and Course Fit tool. Now, I will mention that for the American Express tournament, this kind of all goes out the window because each round, different golfers are going to be playing different courses. It's a varied course event here, or I think Data Golf says it's a multi-course event. So it's a little bit awkward to look at a course history and course fit stuff. As we get into the later part of the spring and summer, start getting into major season, I'll probably do another video, talk a little bit more about what I like to look for here. But if you have the time and the interest here in doing a little bit of additional research, these can be pretty useful tools to dig into. Now, I will mention that this stuff is already factored into our projections, so you want to be careful of double counting here. I think in general, the way that you might want to think about this is saying that for any given reason, you might think that course fit or course history on that course is being under or overvalued relative to a typical course. Now, for me, the way that I end up actually using this is I use it as more of a game theory or a ownership type guide. So I will go in and look and see what are some of the golfers, what are some of the top course history golfers on this course or course fit golfers, and then also try to get a sense of, do I think that ownership is being levered fairly to those golfers? What I have found is that for courses where the perception is that course history matters a lot or that course fit matters a lot, it is overvalued by the field in the terms of ownership projections. So I will use this data here instead to, rather than trying to say, I think course history is more important this week. I think the way I use it is I'll say, I think the field thinks course history is more important this week. These potential golfers might come in higher owned than expected, and they might be guys that I actually want to be careful with my exposure on. So that is something, again, that I typically dive into a little bit more when we get into some of the bigger events, some of the Millie Maker type stuff as the golf season develops here. But those can be really fun tools if you do want to spend some extra time digging into the numbers, doing a little bit more research. The other component of research that I think is useful here, at least to keep your eye on over the course of the season, is weather. The Kevin Roth weather dashboard on Roto Grinders is probably the easiest way to get a general sense of the weather overall, the weather forecast. Typically, all I'm looking for quickly is anything that is extremely windy. The weather looks just particularly bad that might affect golf performance here. Most of the time, I'm really looking for something that Kevin Roth specifically labels as orange or worse here, where it's really saying that that weather looks quite bad. That is, again, something that I go back and forth on how valuable that actually is, primarily because Vegas is aware of the weather as well. Our sims are using Vegas odds as an input, and you'll generally see that apart from the most extreme weather circumstances where you have a very clear split where the morning is beautiful and the afternoon is like playing in a hurricane, most of the time, the weather does not have a dramatic effect on a player's odds anyway. So I'm a little uncertain here about how much that actually matters, but I do think it is important to be aware of weather concerns, especially on the slates throughout the season where it is the most extreme. Now, I do think weather can be a bigger edge on a showdown slate where you are getting paid off for exclusively a player's performance in a given round. I'll probably record another video for Golf Showdown specifically later this season as well. But of course, your approach to researching and making and fine-tuning your golf lineups does not need to be the same as mine. And if you don't have strong opinions at all, that's also totally fine. In general, the main point I want you to go away from this with is that as you are looking for a way to target your research and trying to review your portfolio overall, let your exposure and leverage and pool columns be your guidepost here. It will really help to narrow your focus in and make sure that you're spending the time looking into the players that, if you just trust the sims, are going to be your biggest make or break players in the field. Now, overall, I'm pretty happy with the way that my exposures have turned out here. I probably won't end up making too many other changes, and we'll probably just end up playing with what the sims gave me here. Our golf model really has come a long way. In past years, I would have to make quite a few other changes and make some other tweaks to be comfortable with the types of lineups I was getting, but I'm really happy with what we've got here. So I'm going to go ahead here and just fill these one more time, even though nothing in theory should have changed, and get these uploaded. And I am ready for the slate. Now, if you're looking for a new DFS optimizer for golf season and you want to check this out and you like the way that the tools look, you can sign up for a free 5-day trial on our site, SaberSim.com. That is 5 golf slates. If you play your cards right, you can get the main slate and all 4 showdowns over the course of a 5-day period and check us out, see how the tools work. If you have questions, you can always reach out at support@sabersim.com. In the meantime, thanks for watching. Good luck this season, and I'll see you in the next one.